Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Paes.
Today, we are talking about the Enneagram and reactivity management. Now, one of the things the Enneagram teaches us a lot about is what our automatic reactions are. Often, they're very unconscious, very impulsive. The ways we tend to get triggered, what pushes our buttons, depending on what type we are, and also what those reactions look like. So when we're talking about reactivity, we're talking about often mostly our emotional reactions to things. Now, we already had a podcast about emotions in the Enneagram in terms of what the 9 types tend to feel emotionally or not feel. This podcast will be more about reactivity and what happens when the different types react emotionally and what happens when they don't manage those reactions and how we can learn to manage our reactions in a more conscious way. So what do you want to say by way of introduction about this topic of reactivity management and reactivity itself?
Reactivity management, is something present at every spiritual school, and also it's in any psychologist or psychotherapist's agenda. And it's interesting to me that we say reactivity management and not reactivity control, because we're not searching for control of many kinds. We're searching for awareness of knowing what the reactivity pattern is and managing it. So many times we say we're looking for responding instead of reacting. Now, why is that? It's because, machines react. Human beings are better than that, and they can respond. They can have more than one option. They can be more plural. They can be less predictive. And in a way, that's not what we tend to be in the world when we are truly under the effect of our egos and personalities. We lose that humanity in us, and we start having a very predictable behavior in how we react. So both in what makes us react, which is different for each Enneagram type, and how we do so.
So when we talk about reactivity management, we're really talking about 2 different levels of awareness. When we're identified with our personality, when we're not very self-aware, when we're just reacting from the personality's patterns, we tend to react very emotionally and very automatically in predictable ways. Uh, and of course, the whole point of the Enneagram is to become conscious of these ways that we react so that we can learn to manage our reactions, so that we can bring in more conscious awareness. We can pause and notice the ways that we're about to react, or the ways that we're tempted to react, or the ways that we always react when the same thing happens, and interrupt that pattern, interrupt that experience. So when we develop an inner witness and we start observing the automatic patterns of our personality, I think a big point of focus for us is these, what we'll describe today, are these automatic emotional reactions that we tend to have before we give ourselves a moment to even think about it. So part of the whole process of growing with the Enneagram is to learn to slow down our reactions so that this part of ourselves inside ourselves, the inner observer, the inner watcher, the inner witness, can start to notice, oh, wow, I'm about to react again in the way I always react when something like this happens. And can I take a breath? Can I slow down this process so that I can actually make room to make a different choice? And I think what we're talking about here is what we sometimes hear parents say to kids, like, don't act it out. And we're talking about being able to have an emotional response, but not react from that emotional response, not automatically do that same behavior, like you said, does tend to be behavior that we always do whenever this kind of thing happens, but to be able to almost inside ourselves step back and say, hey, wait a minute, here I go again. Maybe this time I want to hold back on going into action, on doing this uh, reaction, like having this kind of reactivity that I always have. And maybe I want to make a different choice.
Yes. And managing reactivity is not about not saying something that is needed. In fact, I remember when I was at a Gurdjieffian fourth way wisdom school, I learned that many times I had to say even more than I did before, like to my kids. It's just that this had to be a choice. When we are reacting, we don't really have a choice. We just say without thinking. And then we may want to choose to say something, but not that we are feeling that in the inside. It's just the proper thing, the thing that will help the most. Now, I want to stress that each Enneagram type has really huge differences in the ways they react. So even when you say emotional reactivity, I look at myself and say, is my reactivity truly emotional? Because my main reactivity as a five is stopping feeling emotions. So I want to say, and I agree with you that it's all emotional, but not that we will see very easily the reactivity happening out there in a visible way. So, in a way, we need to understand that reactivity is not something that eights have because they fight or they quarrel, or ones because they get angry, or that sixes have because they are anxious and they start saying things. So, all types may have the same level of reactivity. And it's just that we truly need to understand the nine different ways people react.
Yes, I think the level of reactivity is really connected most to how much conscious inner work somebody's done. If you haven't been to therapy, if you haven't done a lot of work on yourself in an intentional way, often it's harder to control your reactions. And again, I agree, the word manage is much better than control. It's harder to manage how you react because you haven't really taken the time to study the ways that you react so that you can improve your ability to manage those reactions. I do want to say a couple of things that I've learned from Gurdjieff, who we often quote Gurdjieff, and he is one of the main sources that we use to gain information about the process of growth and transformation based on a kind of Enneagram approach to growth. And one of the things he says, and you referred to this in the beginning, is that we humans, before we do work to become more conscious, we're like machines. Like you press a button and we react the same way every time. And what he said is that machines who learn to be more aware of themselves, machines that study themselves, stop being machines. So the whole point is to really learn about yourself and with a lot of compassion, study what you do, know yourself better. And the more you know yourself, the more you can see those reactions coming ahead of time, or when they happen, you can recognize them and choose to do something different in a conscious way. Another thing that he said that was important to do at the beginning of a growth path was to struggle against the expression of negative emotions. And when I read that, I remember thinking, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, because when you have an emotion, you have an emotion, and we're all going to have negative emotions and we're all going to express them. So what's wrong with that? But when I studied more and thought about it more, I realized that there's something really positive that comes from being able to stop and interrupt the expression of that negative emotion. So I think it's not don't have negative emotions. We're all going to have them, and we need to be working on being non-judgmental and compassionate with ourselves about the emotions that we have. But it's a whole different thing to act on that emotion. And I learned this in my psychotherapy training. I had a consultant once, and he used to really point out that we could point out to our clients, well, you can have this emotion, but do you necessarily need to do something about it? You don't necessarily need to act on it. So you can think, you can be angry at me as your therapist and want to leave therapy, but maybe you can be angry at me and not leave therapy. Maybe you can stay and we can talk about it. Exactly like you were saying. I think sometimes when we start learning about our reactivity, what we can do in a really positive way is start to communicate with the people around us about our likely reactions, our habitual reactions, so that we start helping people understand us instead of just having the reaction and going into the behavior or the thing that we do as an automatic way of doing or acting out that emotion or that experience.
Yes. And actually, the Gurdjieff's concept of what a negative emotion is very specific. What he really meant about negative emotions is any conditioned emotion. So, and positive for him was any emotion that we're choosing to have and we're developing ourselves to be able to be in touch with. So imagine a 9 on the Enneagram that finds it really hard to be in touch with anger. So having this very peaceful emotion on the inside, which is not actually peaceful, it's more comfortable, but sometimes 9 see it as being at peace, is not positive for Gurdjieff. It's negative. And then getting in touch with anger is positive because it's something that the 9 will need to develop to be able to do. And having said that, I think it's really important to say that the first step for anyone of any type developing the capacity to manage reactivity is to contain the action, the behavior that the reactivity makes us have. So containing the behavior is enough as a first step. And that means that we should not dream about changing the emotion we're feeling on the inside, or even the lack of emotion we're having in the inside while reacting. So it's not feasible for someone starting on this path of managing reactivity to both change the behavior and change the emotional pattern. So the very first step is to work on the behavior only. Then a second step later on will be to not only contain the behavior, but also do an alchemy in the inside of the heart to change that emotion. And later on, there will be other steps like nurturing a higher state of awareness um, at which reactivity will simply not exist. But that's not a goal in the beginning.
What you're saying makes me think of some of my friends who are parents. I think as we learn more about emotional intelligence and parents have learned more about how to help their children have their emotions and not get involved in some of the behaviors that parents don't want their kids to have. I saw a lot of my parent friends saying to their kids, use your words when they're having an emotional reaction, right? Because kids and all of us, we have an emotion and we can't help but act it out. But like you're saying, have the behavior that the emotion leads to. And so when parents say to their kids, use your words, it's almost a way of saying, be more aware of what you're feeling and talk about it instead of translating it immediately into some behavior. Now, of course, if you're angry, you might pound your fist on the table, or you might even, in a way, if you're, again, not managing your reactivity consciously, you might hit someone, right? So it's about having the emotion but not going into the behavior. And in psychological terms, we would often say, don't act it out. When we can't hold our emotion inside ourselves, feel it, understand it, reflect on it, we often act it out. We go right into the action or the behavior without being able to interrupt that process. So this is what we're talking about, is the ways that different types have triggering experiences and then move right into the behavior instead of being able to slow that process down, bring some conscious awareness into the picture and say, okay, I notice I'm having an emotional response, or I notice I'm having a very knee jerk automatic reaction, which is, of course, based on the past. It's based on my personality structure. It's based on what kinds of things bother me and trigger me. Now, I want to say a couple of things about that. I think that often what our key triggers are for each of us have to do with our early wounding or early hurts or things from the past that were painful for us, that we, again, in a very automatic way, react when that sort of sensitive point gets re-triggered or gets touched into. And so I think one of the reasons why we always encourage people to go to therapy and do this kind of inner work is because in therapy and different kinds of therapy, you can do this in different ways, but you learn about what your trigger points are and why you get triggered and what some sensitive points are for you, sensitive experiences. When this kind of the thing happens, I tend to react very quickly because it's a point where I need to defend myself, because maybe it reminds me of a particularly difficult situation or experience that I had that goes back and has deep roots in childhood. And this is also why we often say that many of us have had one kind or another of childhood trauma. And of course, there's different kinds of trauma and different experiences of that. But one of the reasons why it's really important for us to become aware of our early trauma and work through it is because when we don't, we kind of wall it off, understandably, because it's painful to re-experience that. But then we still react from it. It becomes a territory we can't get near and understand because it's too painful and hard, which is understandable. But then when we don't really fully explore that, that becomes exactly the territory where if someone touches something near that, we will react because it's a point of it's a part of ourselves we get very defensive around. We often use the word defensive, and defensive might be another good word to use when we're talking about what kinds of things make us reactive, what kinds of things make us feel like in this very automatic way we need to protect ourselves. And we will do another podcast on the Enneagram types and trauma very soon. But before we do that, I did want to mention that I think that can be a key part of what's underneath some of our triggers.
Yes, and as we grow, our reactivity pattern changes. As we change, it also changes. So I'll give you an example. As a five, my reactivity pattern, that we'll explain later when we talk about fives here, didn't have to do with anger or expressing anger directly. I was more withdrawing, right? Now, today, I am different, and anger is bigger in me. And it's not bad, it's a good sign, and I understand and accept that. But I now have a different challenge in managing another kind of reactivity, which is anger. And I don't have this experience as a five because I've never needed to do it. But of course, at this podcast, we are going to focus on the most common reactivity patterns for each type. Just bear this in mind. Now, B, I have a question to you before we move on to talking about all nine types. Do you think that this particular moment on Earth is harder for us to manage reactivity because we are all polarized in different sides? What do you think?
I think we're in a historical moment where we're seeing on a collective level how hard it is to contain reactivity. We're seeing so much division and so much of a strong reaction on different sides against the other. There's like it's almost like there's no empathy, there's no room for understanding. It's like you can't understand at all why someone else is reacting the way they are, and their reaction makes you react, and then your reaction makes them react. And I think it becomes a kind of a downward spiral. And so I think it's a good moment to talk about this because I think all of us are really struggling with the ways we're getting triggered, not only in our daily lives, just from our own experience or from our interactions with the people around us, but also from what's going on in the world. I think it's really hard for some of us to not react or not feel very, complicated and potentially challenging emotions in response to what's happening in our politics, in our culture, in the world, even things like climate change. I was watching something last night where there was someone saying we have 10 years left to do something about this, and some people might even argue we have less than that. So I think there are things happening in our world all around us that are sort of putting us in a pressure cooker more than we ever have been before. But I know you're really tuned into this collective level of things. So what can you add? What are you thinking right now about that really important piece of this topic?
I agree with you, B. I think it's such a particular moment right now, and reactivity management has never been as hard as it is right now. So I think that all this crazy planet we live in right now is more difficult for us to control, manage any emotion. The collective circumstances just make this even harder. But the good thing is, a little bit that you do right now and the success, a little bit of success that you have in managing your reactivity makes much more difference than ever.
Exactly. I think what we're sort of talking about is whenever we're under stress, it makes it even harder to interrupt our reactive patterns. And many of us are under stress right now because of the conditions of the pandemic. It's interrupted our life patterns. We maybe having to do things differently or be around some people all the time that we don't aren't normally around, or be more alone and disconnected. And also seeing everything that's happening in the world, all the different crises that are happening. I think when we're under stress, it becomes much more difficult. And so, if we look at the challenges that are happening all around us as learning opportunities, I think we can shift our perspective to see that maybe this is actually a real moment of opportunity in terms of learning more about our reactive patterns and getting curious and interested in understanding what's happening for us, and having a lot of compassion and not judging ourselves, and just really strengthening that inner observer that's just neutral and watching and noticing and saying, wow, here's what's happening for you right now. And of course it's happening, there's reasons why it happens. When I was a psychotherapist and one of my clients maybe was talking about some sort of reactive pattern they would have and beating themselves up about it, I would always really interrupt the beating themselves up about it part. And I would always remind people there are reasons why this is happening. There are reasons why you have these reactions. And this is why I wanted to point to, even though we won't have time to go deeply into it, I wanted to point to the fact that a lot of these reactions come from early childhood experience or a long-term pattern of having a specific reaction as a way of at least attempting to protect yourself or defend yourself, even if your defenses couldn't always do their job because of the difficult conditions that you were in. And so I think we go into this discussion of the 9 types and the kinds of things that they react to, and the shape of those reactions and how it gets translated into very automatic behavior, with a lot of desire to really hold this in a space of compassion and understanding, so that instead of people getting critical about themselves when they start noticing these reactive patterns, they can start to just, take a breath, take a pause, have a really compassionate point of view around creating space to just see it more clearly, notice it whenever it happens, and eventually learn to make a different choice. And like you're saying, one of the first steps is just don't go right into the behavior. Just hold back. Stop the process. Allow yourself to enter into the emotion a little bit more and then a little bit more. If you do go into the behavior, don't beat yourself up about that. Don't get too hard on yourself. Just notice after the fact, and with a lot of understanding, say, okay, it was really hard to manage that reaction. Next time I'll try to do it differently. But this may take me a while. That this inner work is a process, and we have to give ourselves a lot of grace when we're making sincere efforts to change, because change is not always easy, and we need to allow ourselves to have some time to be able to learn to do these things.
Yes, and one more point I would like to make. When we react, we are not owning our own responsibility for our part in whatever is happening. Usually, people say, I'm reacting because you did that, right? So it's very, very useful to separate the behavior the other person had as that person's responsibility, and your reactivity as 100% your sole responsibility. So when you react, there is, in a way, a child doing that inside you. And maturity is becoming accountable for that reactivity and naming that it's difficult not to have it, but working so that you get to this point of not having it with all the grace that you've just beautifully talked about. But still, becoming an adult means developing the maturity to not react despite anything that's happening out there.
That's really well said. I think that that is what it's all about. That part of growing, whether we're talking about growing up as an adult and maturing, or having a really conscious inner work process where you are engaged with your self development. This is a lot of what the work is. When we talk about inner work, some people say, well, why do you call it work? Well, because it takes a lot of effort, and sometimes it really feels like work. But just like when we work hard at a goal, we really can see how we get somewhere. I think that when we work at this, it really has the potential to shift our lives in very positive ways, to improve our relationships. When you stop just blaming the other person or projecting your reaction out there onto the world, and exactly like you're saying, take responsibility for, like, oh, this is the kind of thing that triggers me every time. Like for me, for instance, as a two, I notice I get reactive under one particular circumstance, and that is when I see someone else, in my view, becoming not very considerate of other people, or becoming self-interested, or doing something that benefits them that has a negative impact on other people. Like, here's just a very everyday example. When I'm driving in San Francisco where I live, and someone has double parked in a way that's blocking a whole lane of traffic, in the way there's all these people who now their day has been slowed down because they're in this big line of cars, because this one person couldn't find a way to do something more considerate and move their car out of the way. So that's the kind of thing, for me, I've learned over time, is a huge trigger, because as a two, I'm always focusing on how can I make life easier for other people. Now, to a fault, right? That becomes its own problem when I do that too much, when I don't put my needs in the picture and I'm too much considerate of how I impact everyone else. But that that when I know that about myself, I can now recognize, okay, my reaction to that kind of thing is going to be really outsized because of my personality. So I think that's the kind of thing we'll be talking about, right?
I like the example you're sharing, B, because one might think, oh, but what you're saying and doing is fair. It's horrible what that person on the traffic did, but it doesn't really matter what the issue is. Reacting is not good, period, even if it sounds fair from a society's perspective.
Yes, and I have learned over time to have a different reaction when that happens. It used to be that would drive me crazy and I would get very angry. And now, some of the time, not all the time, some of the time, I can see that happening and not feel so upset about it, because certainly in some cases it might be horrible that that person's doing it. Other times there may be a real emergency. Maybe that person really needs to do that, and I haven't really allowed myself to think about what's happening in a broader perspective because of my the narrow perspective of my personality and the ways that I can just react so automatically without taking into account other ways of seeing.
And you can still choose to say or do something about it if it's not a reactivity, if it's a response, if you're not triggered in the inside and then you decide to do something. You can even look like you are angry, but if you're not feeling angry in the inside, it's not a reactivity.
Yes, I think this is an important point because some people may be saying to themselves, there are times when I have an important reaction, and I think it's actually good to have that. Like, for instance, when people get really upset, as they are now, and rightfully so, about becoming more acutely aware of systemic racism, right? That is something that it is important to have a reaction to. However, like you're saying, we're going to be more effective when we do take action to respond to that problem when we're coming from a less reactive place. In other words, I can get mad about that, and there's nothing wrong with my anger. In fact, my anger can be good. It can be important. But if I like throw a brick through the window because I'm so angry about it, that's going to be a lot different than if I get involved in organizing or put my effort into a group that is working in very conscious, constructive ways to change the system. There are different ways of responding. And I think that's the thing that we need to really focus on, is that when we're coming from an automatic, defensive, unconscious, reactive place, the actions we take, the behaviors we engage in are by definition going to be less effective and sometimes even make the problem worse than when we're able to slow down, become conscious, notice what our automatic tendency is, and slow that down to the point where we're able to take that same emotion, which is important. Again, emotions are information. They're really, really good to tune into and understand. But if we can slow our reactivity down, then we can choose the ways we respond and have a much more positive impact in our own lives and the people around us and in the society in which we live. So should we start talking about the 9 types in terms of the ways they react and the reactive patterns associated with them, or is there anything else you want to say in general about this topic of reactivity and reactivity management?
I feel ready to move on to type 8.
Okay. Do you want to start and talk a little bit about how you see the reactivity patterns of type 8?
I can do that. So, eights are always searching for anything unfair that is happening out there, or something unfair that someone says or does. So they're prepared to see something wrong coming up, and they are wired to say something or do something about it. This is why the reactivity pattern for eights is mostly saying or doing something very visibly and showing anger to an extent. It's not that every time eights will be aggressive or angry per se, but there is a bigger possibility that this will happen. So the reactivity pattern for eights is many times going against someone with at least as much strength as they have perceived the person used the first time. Going, getting back to the person, teaching the person something. What would you add?
Yeah, I would say I agree with you that what the kinds of things that make eights react can be things that they're noticing happening that they think aren't right. I think eights in personality can tend to think that their view of what's happening is the only view or the objective truth of what's happening. And so if they see something that's happening that they don't agree with or isn't right, they can very quickly react either, I think, by going into action to change something or do something about it, or expressing anger, or sometimes both. And I think you're right. It's important always to say, because eights get stereotyped as always being angry. I think that eights often do react with aggression. Sometimes it can be at different levels. Sometimes it's a big reaction. Oftentimes, what's happening at a deeper level, I think, for eights is they're hurt. So I think this is another trigger point for eights. And this is one I think they tend to not be very aware of, that something has happened that's hurt them. And because they tend to deny their vulnerability and their sensitivity, they don't register the hurt uh, or the deeper insults or the vulnerable feeling that may have gotten triggered, and instead they go to anger as the defensive reaction. And so sometimes that can be very big. Eights have easy access to anger, which sometimes can be a good thing. But when they're not very conscious, there can be a big angry reaction, often in response to something that hurt them, which they remain unaware of.
Right. A few other things that also trigger reactivity for AIDS are when they see people looking weak or not doing something that they would do if they were on that person's role. Also, when people are not very frank, straightforward, and they're very indirect, so they don't like lack of transparency or what they might judge as being fake. But some other forms of how eights react that are not exactly being aggressive, but are still reactivity, is to talk too much, to do too much, or to just become more controlling. All these are also reactivity patterns we see on eights.
Yeah, I think that's an important one that you named at the end. They're getting more controlling, kind of imposing their will, coming in and having this sense of, I need to do something about this because this is not okay. I think sometimes that's another piece of it. Let's do a short break.
The Enneagram 2.0 podcast goes live every other Thursday on all main platforms. Stay tuned to learn more about yourself and others.
Vi and Uranio offer much more high-quality Enneagram content on www.cpenneagram.com. If you are an Enneagram enthusiast, visit the website now.
Hello, it's me, Uranio. Just to tell you that B and I launched a new online workshop called the Enneagram Masterclass. It's a 6-hour video course that you can access at cpenneagram.com. You can go at your own pace and have lifetime access to it. Many beginner students have already watched it, but advanced students can also learn about the 9 types in a deeper way. We can't wait for you to check it out. Get $75 off your purchase by using code ChestnutPaes75 on cpenneagram.com. So 9s are the type that avoids anger the most in the initial stages. Therefore, it's not very easy to see how they react if you're searching just for anger as a form of reacting. But how is it then that 9s become reactive, and what is it that brings them to that place? Well, first, answering what brings them to react, I think that anyone imposing anything upon them, being authoritarian or harsh, makes nines react. They really don't like that and they react against it. Another thing that makes nines react is lack of harmony in the environment, lots of conflicts, or when people don't value them enough. Because it's true that nines don't value themselves enough, but they feel really sad or mad when others don't include them, don't call them to be, part of something, and they react against it in different ways. Now, the ways that they react are usually passive, like in passive aggression or stubbornness. But nines also react in very specific ways by saying things that people won't like and that don't look to be aggressive, or just sinking in and not moving, and other ways that are passive. What would you say, B, about nines?
Yeah, I really agree with everything you said. I do think that nines react in ways that you probably won't see the reaction itself very often because it's passive. But I agree with you. It tends to be about um, other people disrupting the harmony, other people being too forceful or doing things that will disturb the peace. uh, I once heard the phrase, nines have the fury of a peacemaker. So they get mad at you if you're creating tension, if you're creating a problem, if you're disrupting the harmony that they're trying to maintain. And of course, nines are very oriented toward creating harmony and staying comfortable and avoiding conflict. And so if you're doing something to spark up a conflict, oftentimes that can also help lead to their reaction, in addition to what you said of not being heard, not being included. These are more personal kinds of things, of being overlooked, that I think can create reactions. So exactly as you said, I think we tend to see the reactions of other types more than we do with nines, because the ways they'll react, it's almost like they react on the underground. That it's a very passive reaction, and so it gets displayed in things they don't do, right? So for instance, nines will, if they feel like you told them to do something in either an authoritative way or a pushy way, or you're putting pressure on them and they don't like that, they may react by just tuning you out or not doing what you want them to do. And they may be very aware that they're doing that or less aware that they're doing that. But there can be a reaction of like going completely passive, like, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. And that's, of course, an aggressive response, but a passive one, one where they're making a point of the fact that they are not going to comply with you. But because they're so oriented toward not creating tension or conflict, they will do that on the down low. They will do that in a way where you may not see a ripple on the ocean. It will be something that they're doing behind the scenes or deep inside themselves in a way that doesn't get seen. And it's only much later when the person says, hey, wait a minute, you never did what you said you were going to do, or you told me you were going to do this and then you didn't. It's only when the other person or the people around the nine recognize that the passivity is happening, that they get frustrated. Oftentimes the angry reaction, the active anger, comes up in someone else. So yes, I think these are very important reactivity patterns to note about nines that may not be as obvious as some of the other types. So type ones, what are some of the potential trigger points and reactivity patterns of type one?
So ones react many times also in invisible ways. I mean, non-verbal ways, just by having a very harsh look at someone, by having a very stiff body, by getting very serious. Many times ones say that they don't need to say much. and they don't say much because of that particular reactivity of containing their anger. They might become preachy, they might become a bit critical, but they will lower the voice when they say something because they want to model what is correct. And that's all reactivity. Now, what makes them react many times is when people don't show commitment, they don't do what they said they would do, or what everybody else was expecting them to do, and when they are not consistent or didn't go for a higher quality pattern, did something that the one considers to be wrong or improper, all of this can lead to reactivity by ones. What would you add, B?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I would emphasize that the big trigger point for ones is something that, in their view, is happening that's wrong. If someone's done something that doesn't follow the rules or has a negative impact on other people or is unfair or unjust or is stopping things from happening that are good, not following what they believe are good rules of behavior. I know that my friends who are ones may have reactions when someone litters or when someone hurts someone else or anytime someone does something that goes against what they believe is right. They can have a big reaction, and sometimes you might see that and sometimes not so much.
Another way that ones react is when they are criticized or when they feel criticized. That's actually, in my view, one of the biggest things that makes ones react by criticizing themselves even more and becoming even more tense, and or justifying themselves at times.
Yes, and I do think probably the most common reactivity pattern for ones is some form of angry reaction. Now, this can take different forms. It can look different. It can look different depending on the subtype of the one. Sometimes, and this is an interesting one, they can react through reaction formation. Now, this is the main defense mechanism of type 1. Reaction formation is an unconscious defense mechanism in which we go unconscious to the feeling we're having and we express its opposite. So I think sometimes when ones react, what we see is them getting more correct or more polite or more courteous or nicer, especially the self-preservation one. But all ones can be a bit like this, where they get angry inside, and maybe because they feel very strongly that it's inappropriate to express their anger, or there's not a good way to express it in the situation, or they're just habitually putting a lid on it and trying to control that anger. Sometimes they'll actually get nicer and more. Uh, what you'll see on the outside is friendlier or more positive expression, which is in fact hiding a very angry response on the inside. Now, I grew up with ones, so I will also tell you that similar to nines, there can be a passive aggressive response, but with ones, it's easier to actually see it leaking out than with nines, I think. So just feeling a sense of someone being in an angry mood, you can just sense that the person is being annoyed or the person is irritated or they're giving you a silent treatment, but it's a little bit more obvious that the passive response is filled with sort of a kind of angry energy underneath. All of these are reactive things that ones can do. I also think that ones can go more into action, like trying to make things better and trying to take steps to make something be to be more perfect or to improve the situation or to be of service in some ways where it's kind of about correcting the wrong.
Good. Now, I'm hoping you can start talking about type 2 as a 2 yourself, B.
It's funny, when I was trying to think about my own reactivity, I think there's so much of it. I got kind of confused so I think I might be less clear on type 2 just because there's so many reactions I see myself having. But I would say probably the most common ones or the most central are when I feel hurt by someone, or when I fear that rejection is happening. I think if I don't feel anything in that neighborhood, like not feeling appreciated or not feeling seen and understood, uh, feeling like maybe I've done a lot of good things for a person, or I've been a good friend, or I've been, focusing on my energy on being supportive of that person, and then I get something back that feels hurtful, or like I'm not considered, not seen in a positive light. I feel like that's one of the biggest areas of biggest triggers of reaction for me. Now, my reactivity patterns can take a few different forms. I will say the first line of defense may be either withdrawing. And again, I'm a self-preservation too, so I withdraw a lot as a reaction. I will move farther away, and there is a reactivity in that. It's almost like, well, I was really nice to you and you're not being nice to me, so I'm going to take myself away from you as a punishment. So there can be, now sometimes I withdraw with more consciousness and it's more a thoughtful thing, like, okay, maybe I need to take a step back and really examine what's happening here. But oftentimes it can be well, I'm just not going to talk to you again. Or, if you don't like me, then, forget about you, I'm going away. So that is a reaction you may or may not see. And then I think there are other reactions which can be like trying harder. So if maybe I feel misunderstood, or like you don't like me, sometimes I can try harder to impress you, or make you like me. And if that doesn't work, then I think there can be an angry reaction, or some form of anger reaction. Now, again, as a 2, I think sometimes my anger can come out as passive aggression for sure. And then I think at a later stage, or if the trigger is more acute, or if I'm more stressed, I think then I can really respond with anger, resentment, a kind of feeling of like, I was really good to you, and now you're doing something bad to me, and that's really bad. And so I think there are sort of different levels of it. And I apologize if I'm making it too complicated. Maybe you can help me make this clearer. But I think I've been, studying my reactivity for a while, so I can see it in many situations, and I can see many things triggering it, and I can see it coming out in different ways. So I hope I'm being clear, at least in part, and maybe you can help me be more clear.
I think this has been very handy for me. I'll be listening to this podcast a few more times to
Yeah,
learn when I
actually,
have done something bad and you are reacting these ways.
maybe you should give the talk about the ways twos react, since you've been, you probably write a book about it now that you've seen me reacting to you for a long period of time at close quarters.
Well, I can say a few things, but some don't really refer to you because I think it's also subtype related, and a few more things. But one thing that I see some choose doing is to remind that person all that they have done for them. And it's like, after all that I've done for you that you've never asked for. And in a way, there is a reactivity that goes that way. And sometimes I see some choose remembering day and time of what they did for that other person and tell that other person about it when they're not getting what they want in back. Now, I think that sometimes there is a simple emotional display that might be the reactivity that comes from the chew. It's tricky to say, but for instance, the chew is not as enthusiastic with you as they used to be, or they don't smile at what you're saying, or they don't say much. And that is a reactivity. Sometimes it's just that the Jew is really, sad or going through something else. But many times, I think it's an indirect punishment to the person that is so much used to the Jew being in a certain way. And then I won't give you this benefit of you feeling well with me right now. So I think these are a few ways that sometimes choose do it.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a way, exactly like we're saying, there can be a trying harder, there can be a moving away and creating more distance as a punishment. And then, of course, different forms of emotional reactions or response or displays of emotion that can come out, especially after we've been trying not to and we can't help it anymore, that the response is too much or the reaction is too much, rather.
Or even withdrawing your help that will lead the person to not be successful. I've seen this at times,
Oh, definitely.
not with
I
you.
agree with that one. Well, I'm familiar with that one. Let's say, yeah. So, what about type threes? What kinds of reactions do they have, and what kinds of reactivity patterns do we see in threes?
So I think that reactivity on threes is trickier to see because of image, because they are sometimes playing a role in front of you, and because they try hard not to show their emotions right away, although they are very emotional. Now, some of the things that make threes react have to do with criticism to them in ways that are only hard or negative and no positive has been talked about. And when something is threatening their image, also when, whatever, or when people are delaying processes or going slower in something, threes really tend to react against that. Or even when people don't approve them as much as they need or they feel they need. In a way, these things make threes feel really sad in the inside. But most threes don't stay more than a second or two feeling sad. They need to do something about it. And reactivity might be at times saying good things about themselves or justifying something for you or trying to say, look, I did my part. And by the way, it's not for all threes by no by any means, but many times I've seen threes saying that they were not the ones who were responsible for something, and actually other people were. So they delegate responsibility for others or accuse others. And maybe another thing that is a reactivity for threes is just doing more and more in a frantic way. But usually, what I see is that threes not only go do something, they say something to protect their images. What do you think, B?
Yeah, I think threes get reactive when someone creates an obstacle between them and their goal. Threes are very goal oriented and they tend to be on task and moving in a particular direction. And if you get in the way or if you slow them down or if you create a problem, I think that can often be something I see threes getting reactive to. Often the reactivity has to do with an impatience that gets displayed. Another thing is if you do something that causes them to fail or threatens failure in some ways, maybe of a common project or something that they're doing. And of course, like you said, threatening their image in some way or not recognizing them for something they're doing. I think all of these are things that can trigger reactions. I do think they tend to react by working harder and doing more and not allowing themselves to be aware of the emotion that has been triggered. And so sometimes it's very much of a behavioral reactivity, a kind of working harder, like you said, often frantically. I think sometimes they react with anxiety, and the anxiety drives them to work more and perform more and achieve more. It's almost like I'm feeling something bad inside, so I'm going to make myself feel better by having more of a success or getting more done. Or, it's like the personality, I think all of the types do, but it's like the three personality doubling down on the original thing of like, I'm going to do things more and work harder and not feel. I think eventually there can be more of an emotional reaction, but I think the first level of reactivity for threes is avoiding their emotions even more, by going more into action. Although I do think, especially in anger, can leak out as impatience, with people, with not listening to people, with kind of moving faster and sort of trying to get people out of their way.
Yes. Another way that I see threes reacting is by just feeling a big lack of motivation. I see that a lot in threes. Like when people don't praise them, when, nobody celebrates, or when they just think that other people are not as enthusiastic or active as the three wish they were, then they might get really demotivated. But it's mostly when they don't get personal recognition for something. And of course, this lack of motivation usually don't last long.
Yes, I hear threes talk about feeling really bad about something and they just kind of collapse on the couch and watch movies all weekend, so there can be another kind of reaction that I think people don't see very often. It's like usually happens behind closed doors, where the three really either zones out or kind of, really, collapses into kind of a state of lethargy, like you're talking about, gets really demotivated. So what about fours? Let's talk about what fours react to and how they react. What would you say first?
I think fours react to not being listened to. They react to people not being sensitive, either with them or with others. They react to lack of passion around by other people who are more passive or neutral. They also react to limits that people put on them when it comes to express their individuality, like simple things sometimes, even like if they can't decorate their work table, if they can't bring their personal touch to what they are doing. They can also be reactive when it comes to not being allowed to create something new and to just go by the book or to follow routines that might bring them to react, and more things that I think you will cover. But the reactivity pattern here is very emotional, always, is to leak out emotions most of the times. And I think for all three subtypes, although definitely less so for the self-preservation for, but reactivity, almost we can almost not talk about one pattern only of reactivity for force. I think that self-press force many times tend to be quiet and go be alone, or start um, suffering in the inside mostly, while social force cry and complain and get oversensitive, and sexual force complain very harshly and become angry.
Yeah, I agree that the three fours reactivity patterns varies a lot by subtype, but I do want to add a few things to what you said in terms of what fours react to. I think a big one is not being understood, not being heard, not being understood, especially on their own terms. Like you might think you're hearing what they're saying, but they don't agree with you. In other words, they're expressing themselves. They very much want to be seen, heard, understood as they are, as a unique person. And when they get the sense that people aren't understanding them, aren't paying attention to them, aren't appreciating their unique contribution or what they're saying, their unique communication, I think this can be a big trigger for fours. And also abandonment, when they fear that someone is disconnecting or abandoning them or judging them for something that's wrong with them. And again, fours often have an underlying sense that there's something wrong with me. So it can be like that's getting confirmed by the outside world, and that feels really bad. And yes, I agree with you that the reactivity often takes a different form of emotional expression or behavior that is acting out some emotion. For self-preservation fours, it can be a little bit like threes. They work harder. They sort of suffer more silently. They get more masochistic potentially. I think social fours can dwell more in sadness, in sort of more of a victim mentality. They can complain more and talk more about how things are not good for them. And I think the sexual four gets angry as a first line of defense or reactivity. They can throw a lot of anger out there, and it's only when they do more work and they need that anger to kind of get out and be heard. It's only when that happens that they can experience a reaction that's more at a deeper level, sometimes about shame or not feeling enough, or then they can register the hurt. But the first line of reactivity is very angry for the sexual four. So shall we talk about fives? Why don't you start talking about type 5, since you're an expert on this type?
Okay. So, what over time I learned about my own reactivity, and I do think that most fives have similar patterns, is that we withdraw in so many different ways. We are very creative in how to withdraw, you know. I think that the main way is just staying quiet and not talking much. That is reactivity for fives. Another way is not being available for the person, either in concrete ways, but also if you are physically together with that person, it can be just a sense of unavailability that the other very easily experiences. It's like, I'm here, but I'm not here for you. And it's not only for doing things, and it can even be that the five will keep doing things, but it's just even energetically, emotionally not being there. Another way that fives react is by getting really hurt in the inside, feeling hurt. I don't think that it's only an emotion. I think it's a reactivity, feeling hurt, because there is a way that we make sure that we will stay feeling hurt with a person if we allow that to happen. And therefore, I won't say anything to you. I won't communicate with you. I'll be disappointed in a long suffering instead of just doing something about it or talking to you about it. There's another way that us fives react, which is just being very cold, not connecting with you as easily. And you could notice this at times in our language. We become more formal, a little less spontaneous, and maybe we downgrade you in terms of how we communicate with you. I mean, through what means, like we'll text only and not talk. So there are ways and ways that fives express their disappointment, but usually fives don't go the right way, which is talking about it and sharing the emotions and staying engaged within a discussion.
Yes, I'm reflecting on my experience of you, and I think the first sign that tells me that you don't like something that I've done is when I don't hear from you. when I've texted you and a whole day goes by and I'm not hearing anything, or maybe if 2 days go by, I know I'm really in trouble. So sometimes it's your absence that is the sign of your reaction, in my experience.
Yeah, it's usually reaction, I must say. Although it can be something else. I'm just, you know, doing something else, but it's usually a reaction. Now, what I think are things that make fives react are not only invasion, but when the person does something against our own expectations. And boy, do we have expectations. It's a lot of expectations that are almost never named or shared. And so whenever the person does something that goes against these expectations, we react. Another thing is lots of demands upon us, or people who don't give us a break, like always talking about problems, or it could be having no limits for something like working, or doing an activity, or talking to us at any time, or anything that we perceive as this person needs too much from us.
That's really clear. And I think that will be very helpful to people who aren't fives because, again, the reactivity can be silent, it can be withdrawal, it can be, uh, a sense of quiet. And that was the first thing I had noted is that I think the big reactivity pattern is getting more quiet. And when there's no response, when we're not seeing anything, we often don't really understand what's happening. So I think you've done people a big service by helping us understand what kinds of things trigger you as a five and what the reaction looks like, because it's very different than, say, some of the other types where the reaction is more obvious. So type six, what can you tell us about the way type six reacts and what they react to?
It's interesting with sixes, in my view. Of course, there is the basic reactivity of becoming fearful, anxious, nervous, and asking even more questions, and you know being phobic or counterphobic. All that is true, and very easy to understand for one who already knows a bit about sixes. But in practice, I also see other very interesting ways how sixes react. One way is just becoming very calm and not saying anything. It's almost like I can't I can't believe that you're not seeing it, or you're doing this. So it's pointless for me to keep informing you that you should be anxious or worried about what's going on. So I'll be calm myself. Or even a reactivity when something bad happens, that usually sixes become calm as the first reaction. Now, another reactivity that sixes have is to become very mild because there is fear involved. It's like when sixes are angry, and not as much the sexual six though, but I think that both self-present and social sixes, when they become fearful, they don't get mad. They are actually fearful of anger itself, and they may be even warmer, or light, or somehow just looking very rational, very reasonable, and that might be a reactivity because they don't trust you at that moment, at least. Now, things that make sixes react are not knowing the truth, lack of transparency. Make sure that you bring stuff on the table. That's what sixes prefer. They don't like you to hide information or opinions from them. They like to be informed. Another thing that makes them react is when the person is not completely sincere, or is acting in ways that look contradictory, or when people are not really concerned with what's going on. They are not showing a basic level of concern and worry that for them is very important.
Yes, I think with sixes, there is a straightforward sense of what makes them react, which is something that inspires fear in them. Now, the way they react, I think, really varies by the subtypes. Like four, the three sixes are very different from one another, and they really have three different ways of reacting and coping with fear. And so I do think that, exactly like you're saying, when something scary happens or threatens to happen, it's sort of like they're scanning the horizon for what could go wrong. And if something triggers, I think of it almost a little bit like a PTSD response. I think the post-traumatic stress disorder idea is something that not only applies to people who have experienced a trauma like war. I think we all have that kind of a response. I think that's something that's kind of universal. When something touches into something that's been a trigger point for us, something that's been hard or scary or traumatic, we all react. And I think sixes are a little bit the prototype for this, that there's a sense of like kind of looking for that thing that might threaten or go wrong. And so when they get a taste of something that's happened before, or that a difficult experience might happen that they're already really working hard to avoid, sometimes that is something that really triggers them. But of course, they respond in really different ways. As you were already saying, there can be an angry reaction if it's a one-to-one or sexual six. There can be a kind of reaction that almost looks a little bit like type one, like a you're not following the rules, like a formal kind of imposing the rules, imposing a kind of sense of authority that I think social sixes can have. Or with a self-preservation six, it can be almost a little bit of a two-ish reaction of a, like you're saying, getting warmer, trying to make more of a connection, as a way of trying to find protection or diffuse you as a sense of threat, if it's feeling like there can be something that's more interpersonal happening. So let's talk about type 7. What kinds of things make sevens react, and what does their reactivity look like?
Oh, I think that sevens react when people are negative, when people are trying to impose a certain course of action upon them and taking their options away. They react when there's something boring that they need to keep doing or that others ask them to keep doing. They react against having routines. They react against places, environments that people are not positive in general, that people don't celebrate, don't have fun, all of this and more. But the main ways that sevens react are based in the intellect, in my view. They come up with reasoning, a lot of justification, a lot of good reasons why things are not working. They also use a lot of humor in ways that are not only light, that can be heavy humor, like, mocking the other person indirectly and more, a little cynical humor. Also, they may react by just, being even more rebellious. Because you're trying to control me, I'll show you how rebellious I can get. And some sevens can be quite angry as a reaction also. I think it depends a little bit on the instinctual sequence. And sometimes sevens can be like that in one place, like at home, but not at work. So I think it varies. I think that for sevens, it varies a lot, actually, how they react. But the main patterns are these ones. But what do you think?
Yes, I do think that a big trigger point for sevens that makes them react is uh, any kind of sense that they're being limited, that their freedom is being curtailed, that they're being put in a box, or that they're being reined in. I think that's a big trigger for sevens. I think sometimes their reaction can be getting really charming. You mentioned rebellion, and I think sevens engage in rebellion a lot, but it's not as obvious as other forms of rebellion. So it's sort of rebellion through getting more friendly, or as you say it, more funny, or being charming as a way of disarming you or pushing you away in a way that you may not see. I also think another trigger point for sevens is the introduction of pain into a situation. So if they're being sort of pushed into something that's painful in any way that they don't want to feel and they habitually avoid a lot of painful experiences or painful emotions, they can often react by getting more positive or focusing on what's happy or what's fun. Sometimes I think when sevens are triggered, they speed up their pace. They can be very quick thinkers and they can do things fast. And I think sometimes they get a little bit more frantic and more fast paced as a form of reactivity. And I think definitely they can get sort of funny and humorous as a deflection. So as a way of deflecting attention from something that they don't want you to pay attention to as a kind of reaction. And I agree with you that sevens can get angry also as a form of reaction, but I don't think that's a first line often. I think first they might try charm or withdrawing or maybe a kind of intellectual manipulation. But if that doesn't work, oftentimes then I think there can be an angry response that also comes in as a way of like, don't control me, don't tell me what to do, don't limit me, because I think not having their full freedom to choose what they want to do, that can also be something that really makes them react. It's time for our top 5.
Top 5.
What is our top 5 today, B?
The top 5 today is the top 5 types where it's difficult to see their reactivity. Their reactivity isn't so obvious as reactivity. Make sense?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Okay, would you like to start? What's your number 5 least obviously reactive type?
It's you, Beatrice. It's type 2. Yeah, I think that it's sort of sometimes obvious because 2s are usually very emotional and therefore you can see the emotions in them frequently, and they are also expressive. But on the other hand, they are indirect and they are sometimes it's a strong word perhaps, but deceiving. Like they hide what they are thinking or even feeling at times to find the best way to convey messages. So it's 2. What is your number 5?
My number 5 is 2. Same thing.
Oh.
Yes, I agree with you. Obviously, it's funny because first I put 2s higher up towards number 1, but then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, actually, no, I think they belong at number 5 for the same reason. I think there are times when 2s hide their reactions, or their reactions are more subtle, like it's, I'll just maybe withdraw from you a little bit, or I just maybe won't give you as much as I was giving you before, or I'll just not be quite so nice to you and see if you notice. Things like that, which are more subtle. But then I think at a certain level, sort of when pushed a little bit farther, I think then 2s get more obviously reactive, more if there's a more resentful response or more angry response, I think sometimes that's becomes more apparent, let's say.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So we agree on that. All right. So what's your number 4?
My number 4 is me. It's 5s. Because on one hand, I think that 5s are not very obvious because people don't really see isolation and staying quiet as a reaction as easily as they see aggression or anger. But on the other hand, when you understand that the reaction is withdrawal, then it's pretty obvious, because fives are not too good in hiding what they are feeling or thinking. And, they don't care much about if you are going to notice or not, that they want to go be alone. And they're not as concerned with image. So fives are my number 4. What about you?
My number 4 is type 7. And this is because I think sometimes, especially for lower level reactivity, you may not notice that the 7 is reacting, because sometimes it can be they're just speeding up a little bit, or they shift the focus, or they make a joke, or they get excited about something. I think there are times when a 7's reactivity isn't really noticeable as reactivity.
Interesting. It's type 9. I believe that 9s are hard to see when they react, for instance, because they keep smiling if everything is fine, or if nothing is fine, and the smile is not too different. At the same time, when you learn to identify passive aggression and stubbornness, then it becomes easier. I don't think it's the easiest type to see the reactivity happening, but it's not the most difficult one. So this is my number 3. What about you? What is your third?
My number 3 is type 3. I believe 3s tend to hide their reactivity in being busy and doing things and moving faster, and you don't always see them expressing what's going on inside. Sometimes because they're not connected to their emotions, other times because they just don't share it. They just focus even more on work.
Okay.
So what's your number 2?
It's type 7. A little bit for the reasons that you already talked about for 7s, but I also think that they rationalize, and when they do, they don't really let you know that they are not happy with you, and they can very well keep, even making jokes or playing around with you, but they are intimately saying, I really didn't like what you did, and you won't see me as much in the future, So I think it's not very obvious, because 7s are sort of masters in not letting you know that they are feeling sad or disappointed or anything that's negative. So this is my second. What is your second?
My second is type 5. For many of the reasons you said, but I think I ranked them a little bit more highly because maybe they're a little more of a mystery to me. I just think a lot of times they don't show their reaction on the outside, and like you said, their reaction is withdrawing or going away or not saying anything. And so it's almost like I think the absence of reaction is their reaction, and I just think that's very difficult to see. But as you say, of course, once you know the 5 better, then you can become more aware of the signs. For instance, one of my very good friends is a self-preservation 5. And over time, I noticed that how she would register her disapproval of something I was saying or doing is she just wouldn't say anything. So all of a sudden I noticed, because oftentimes when I would share something with her or talk about something I was doing, she would have a lot of opinions and a lot of comments. But I noticed that if I would mention something and she just didn't say anything at all, after a while that stood out. I really started noticing, okay, I think she really doesn't like what I'm doing because she just didn't say anything. But I think it takes a while to learn that language of the 5. And if you don't have a 5 in your life who you're close to, sometimes they can remain a mystery.
But you do see my reactivity more easily right now, don't you?
I do. And I think your reactivity is more obvious for a few reasons. One is I know you well and we work together closely. Another is that I think you being a social 5 might have something to do with it as well, and perhaps being Brazilian. But yes, I definitely notice your reactivity. And sometimes, like I said, it's in the absence of you that I notice that you're reactive. Like, he never responded to that last text. But other times it's when you tell me, and that's one of the things actually I appreciate about you lately is you will tell me if you're feeling something that's not good about me, and you'll be very forthright about it. So of course, while it's not always easy to hear, I'm always glad that you're sharing your reactions with me more clearly, and of course your responses, not just your reactions.
Okay, good to know.
So what's your number 1 least obviously reactive type?
It's type 3. My experience with 3s is that as soon as they feel hurt about something, they disconnect from their emotions, at least in a way that you won't see what's happening. And they will keep feeling hurt for a long time. They will, even cry or work with themselves, but not in front of the other person. And as 3s adapt a lot and they transform in whoever you want them to be, then they don't show that they are upset very easily. I don't think it's easy at all for 3s to show that they are upset or annoyed, unless it's upset with a lack of result, or with you not being committed, or not doing a certain piece of work. But emotional upset is not very common for 3s to show right away, and the impulse to push emotions away happens very quickly. So for this reason, I think that 3s hide away their emotions in reactivity more than any other type.
So in my number 1 position, I have type 9, for many of the reasons that you suggested. I just believe that 9s, because they want to maintain harmony, because they aren't always in touch with their emotions or their anger or other kinds of reactive, defensive emotions that they might express, they tend to either not be in touch with them or choose not to express them, or express them in very passive ways that people just may not detect. So I put number 9 there. They're the types that might be having an internal reaction all the while they're smiling at you and nodding. So I think there's a way that we can really think that 9s are having one reaction when really they're having a different response inside. Which is why I love one of the exercises you came up with first, but now I assign this a lot to 9s, where when they're having a problem with someone, you have them say on one side of the paper, what are the things they said to the person? And then what are the things on the other side of the paper they thought about saying but didn't say? And I think that can always be a very funny exercise for 9s, because those lists are so different. So that was our top 5 for today. We want to thank you for listening and ask you to join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, Enneagram 2.0, find your personality. Chestnut, Paes, Enneagram Academy. What's your type? What's your subtype? So much you can learn. You can be amazing. Go ahead and transform. It's for yourself and others. Grow and follow the flow. And also for the planet, yeah, let your mind blow. It's from Paes and Enneagram. Time for you to know and be your best self with Enneagram 2.0. Psychology, self-mastery, work in relationships, spirituality. Come and join the podcast. Oh yeah, it will be fun. Explore the challenges that from now you'll overcome. Hey, Enneagram 2.0. Tune in, yeah, it's your personality. Enneagram 2.0. Chestnut, Paes, Enneagram Academy. Hey, Enneagram 2.0. Tune in now.